Okay, everyone, I think we're going to do this. Welcome. Welcome to Using JAMstack with Agility CMS. This is our first time doing a webinar and also live streaming it on YouTube. So we're really excited about that. You're going to be emailed at the end of this with a survey and some questions to help us improve. But we're really excited to just have a chance to talk to all you folks about a technology that we're seeing a lot of buzz about. We're getting a lot of questions, and let's get started. So the most important slide today. So we're in this together. We really feel that, we want to partner with our partners and developers out there. We want to partner with our customers and develop close relationships and learn more together. So if you do have questions, it's okay to interrupt. In the Zoom feature, you can use the sort of raise your hand thing or just start a chat. James is sort of keeping an eye on that for me while I'm talking, and when he's talking, I'll watch it. But also, if you're watching live on YouTube, feel free to use the chat function in there, and we'll respond to you as quick as we can.
If you have any sort of questions, sorry, Joel, didn't mean to interrupt there.
That's okay.
I was just going to say, if you have any specific questions, it actually might be easier to use there's a sort of Q&A feature in there that you may be able to use too. I don't know. We'll try it out, see how it goes.
Yep, perfect. Let's get started. So introductions. My name is Joel Varty. I'm president here at Agility. I've been with the company for many years. I've spent a lot of time working on the product itself, but now I spend a lot more time actually interacting with customers and partners and doing some strategic sort of planning around what is the direction we're going to be taking and how can we better work with our customers and partners and potential customers as well to sort of solve the problems that are happening today. And so this is one of the reasons why, I have to credit James for bringing JAMstack up, many months ago as like, this is the technology we need to be looking at. And I said, this is crazy. You don't use JavaScript on the front end, not the back end. But I'm a convert, loving the idea of JAMstack, really love working with it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Joel. My name is James Vidler. I'm the VP of product. I've been building websites for the better part of a decade. A lot of that actually using Agility CMS to manage content and things and building integrations with that. And, throughout that time, whether it's supporting other customers or building other websites and other sort of server rendered stacks, got tired of, all those performance issues that can happen in a server rendered site. So I'm just really tired of tired of things going down in the middle of the night. And I think JAMstack is something that, if done right, can really help alleviate those things. And who knows, if we had started building websites like this years ago, I might have a bit more hair left.
Me too. Just out of interest's sake, James is joining you from Toronto, from our WeWork office, which is our Toronto headquarters. I am joining you from snowy Port Hope, Ontario, where my train was canceled this morning because of various reasons, whatever. So it's great that Zoom allows us to be able to do this, to have a virtual webinar. Be really interested to see where you guys are coming from. If you want to shoot those in the comments, that'd be really interesting to see the different locations where people are watching from. Let's move forward. So in case you didn't notice, we really recommend using JAMstack. We love it as a technology. There's a ton of buzz about it in the sort of the industry, but also just in general. If you aren't using it now, then this is a great way to start learning, a great time to start learning everything you can about it. So what is this JAMstack thing that we've been talking about? So JAMstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. Very simple. So in this case, Agility CMS, we want to be your API. It's your content API. We have an SDK specifically geared to make it easier to get your content where you need it, which is into DevOps processes like JAMstack. Obviously, you use JavaScript for all the coding. And for the markup, we recommend things like front-end frameworks that are going to generate. So you could just code, you could just code raw HTML and vanilla JavaScript. Yes. But we recommend using front-end frameworks such as React. A majority of the developers out there know JavaScript, a vast majority, but a majority of those JavaScript developers know React. So we would really recommend that as a framework. Of course, there are other frameworks as well. But one of the things that does, since you now have this thing that is in use by a majority of people, you can find developers to actually work on it much more easily. So if you're sort of a leader in this industry and you're hiring people, it's much easier to find JavaScript developers that have front-end type skills, that know React, that you can use to work on your projects. And the net effect is you end up launching way faster, and you can iterate much more often on these DevOps workflows that have JAMstack.
Yeah, and like we're starting to see, you know, graduates that come out of these sort of developer bootcamp programs that are fairly short in length. They come out of there knowing React. They come out if you're actually learning a lot of these frameworks. So, you know, someone doing a 3-month program can come out and be able to be instantly productive and be able to build, you know, performant, scalable websites using this technology. And certainly, yeah, Jason Rundell, as he points out, smaller service space for attacks infrastructure. So yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about security too as a major benefit.
Yeah, let's just step back for a second and look at server rendered websites. Sort of, why we could call them legacy websites at this point, but this is the more mainstream way of doing it. That sort of JAMstack is a reaction to, I would say. So typically, when you're serving content on the web, you have a web server that's going to do your work, and that could be, and usually what that has is there's an HTTP server plus there's an application server on top of that, like ASP.NET or PHP or something else that's running, you know, Java, running those engines as well. You can also run Node Express as a server to run Node, but we're not talking about that as much. So when browser requests come in, this web server has to do some work. It has to take some code that was compiled and deployed on that server and combine it with some content that was also, you know, sent in there somewhere. It may call it an API call to it or whatever, could be in a database. It's going to combine all that at runtime. So at the time that request comes in, and service that request. So if you want to service more browser requests, you have to have, oh, it looks like my camera just died. Give me a second here to switch.
Well, let me take over where Joel left off there. I think one of the things that that can be problematic about this model too is that your code is deployed there and your code doesn't change, but your content can change in somewhat real time. So, you know, if you're using a CMS, for example, and you're publishing content or you're changing content on the fly, that change essentially happens somewhat immediately. And that gives you a bit of an area for risk, because if an editor, you know, changes content in a way that somehow your application code didn't account for, you might run into something like a null reference exception, or, you know, some weird layout issues that you weren't tested. So the idea of having content and code sort of deployed and managed separately can be a little bit difficult to manage at times.
Yeah, and this is what JAMstack is kind of a reaction to, right? We've seen these kind of problems. We've all known the kind of performance issues that come with web servers. You know, and spanning it into web server farms, it can get expensive. So that's kind of the landscape we're playing in. We're trying to react to here. Now, the DevOps process for server rendered websites is pretty straightforward. The developer is going to check in your code. It's going to go through some kind of build process. And then usually it's going to go through, you know, a staging server, and that build will move to be released to a UAT server or a production server. And then we tend to scale out the production servers to have, you know, there's more availability in there in terms of like a web farm and load balancing and that sort of stuff. And if we're previewing the site, we typically preview it on like staging or UAT before it goes live. But as James was saying, there's a lot of variables in that code, right? As you know, it can get complex and things can change. Sometimes I'll only have my live content available on the production server. So depending on what my code did, it could have worked great on staging or worked on my local machine when I tested it. But then when I test it on production, I gotta wait until it's at runtime till I actually, you know, use it. And there's been techniques, you know, things like app services in Azure allows you to do like swapping of instances and stuff. It gets really complex to do that. And folks have a hard time, developers like you and I have a hard time sometimes getting that right as these sites get more complex.
Yeah, and you know, something to note here too is like that staging, UAT, and prod environments, those all might be hooked up to either, you know, like a sandbox content CMS instance, or maybe it's using staging. There's all these other things you need to take into consideration there is what content are those going to use, and sometimes they're different.
I'm just going to stop for a second and acknowledge the fact that I switched cameras and I'm now showing my kitchen, to which I didn't think I'd be showing off to everyone, but it's like working from home. It's awesome. Okay, cool. So let's talk about just Agility CMS content for a second, because if you've already worked with Agility CMS, you know that we've always had a .NET API that has synchronization. We also have JavaScript APIs. Well, it's actually an open API that we've created JavaScript SDKs for that give you REST calls, but there is also a sync API for JavaScript that you can use to pull content in, and it actually syncs both your staging and your live mode content locally down to your build server. So that fits in perfectly with the idea of JAMstack and static site generation. So if we look at how that gets used in a DevOps flow, we have what's called a build server. So instead of a web server, we have a build server that's going to actually do all the work of combining your code and the content, like Agility CMS content, at build time, not runtime. It's going to build it together, and it's going to create static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript based on the framework that we've used.
Yeah, and the key thing there, combining content and code in your deployments. So essentially nothing can change in your exported HTML unless something goes through that build process. So that gives you a sort of single point where you can have automated tests run. A good example of that might be you might want to run like a Google PageSpeed Insights or Lighthouse Labs test on your build to be able to track, okay, did that content that just update, is that going to negatively impact my page performance? And you can sort of stop that build from going through. In that case, you can also do things like accessibility audits and things like that too, all automatically. When you have content that's changing in real time on the web server, you have to do those things reactively. It's like, oh shoot, some content got updated yesterday. We need to go back and fix this. This other way around gives you a single point to be able to control that entire process.
So we've gone through that build process. We have this sort of bundle. It's really just a folder of static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. It could have image and other files in there too, whatever the build said it needed to have. Those files are going to sit somewhere in online storage, like a blob storage for Azure. It could be S3. There's also lots of other storage mechanisms out there, and they're delivered globally via a CDN. Okay, so this is really the second main difference. So we've switched from having a web server to a build server. So all the logic happens at build time. And now in terms of the actual delivery of this content, we put it out on a CDN, and that gives us a ton of benefits.
And CDN is really, really changing the way the internet works right now. And I truly believe the days of having a sort of single web server, or even just like a group of web servers in a single data center that all the requests go to, and that's where all your content lives. The days of that model, I think, are going away, because now with a lot of these modern CDNs and having all this great tooling, it's so easy to be able to push your sort of content out to all of these CDN nodes all over the world. And when you're in that scenario and a user tries to access your website, they're no longer going to have to travel to wherever data center your server resides. They'll be able to hit a CDN node that's closest to them geographically. So that means, much lower initial response time consistently for all of your users, no matter where they're located. And some other great things about CDNs now too is, they're really expanded the ability to run logic and functions at the edge now too. So now there's all this logic that doesn't have to live within your website code base necessarily. It can actually be deployed to the CDN layer and sort of have, that whole infrastructure completely abstracted away from you, similar to the idea of a serverless function. A good example of that would be, moving, if you have any redirect logic on your website that needs to redirect users to, different areas of your site, depending on where they're coming from, that can be a fairly expensive operation if your application has to do all those things. Or if you have a static site, that's just not even possible at all, because you can't really run that logic. To move those out into a CDN node can have a lot of benefits.
Yeah, and typically those languages to run at the edge are almost always in JavaScript. So it's really, really good. I know that all the different cloud providers have those. One of the things we didn't really talk about yet, that I think is maybe the biggest benefit, you kind of touched on it, James, is the idea of an atomic build. So the build happens and it generates my files that are this version of the website at this point in time. So my complete site is now sitting in a folder somewhere. I can then test that site before it goes live. Netlify in particular, as a provider, does a really great job of this. As you know, it has like a command line interface where you can have the build say, hey, build's out, but it doesn't go to production yet. It goes to this sort of staging link that you have. You can test that, run speed tests on it, and do all the different things that you need to make sure that that build is good. And then you can go live with that build at that time. And if you go in and find something with your build later that's like, oh my goodness, we didn't want that to go live, or there's a problem with this part of the site, you can roll back to a known time when it was good. Hey, it was really good 2 days ago. Let's go back to that build until we're good with this and we can fix this.
And a lot of these services can provide you a unique URL to be able to view that build too. So it's not like you have a single UAT environment anymore that just keeps getting overwritten with your latest stuff. You have a backlog history of all of the updates you've sort of ever made. And can, as Joel said, you can quickly roll back and select one, or even just go back and look at it for reference to be like, hey, what did we do last year at this time? What did our website look like again? What was our page speed score like? All those sorts of things.
Yeah, now just taking a quick break here. If anyone has any questions, you can use the raise hand feature or just do a chat thing. And what I can do is I can just click on anybody's name and allow them to talk if they want to actually ask a question. So at any point in time here, please feel free to interrupt. I'm good with that. Obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can't interrupt that way. So just in the right hand panel, just type out whatever thoughts are going through your head right now that are relevant to the
if not, we'll also have dedicated time afterwards just for open questions too.
Good call. So, what are the benefits of static site generators? Sort of in a nutshell, when you're talking about this to other people, one of the things we wanted to be able to do today is give you the ability to tell people, hey, what are the sort of quick hitting things that you're going to get? First off, static sites are lightning fast. There is no code to compile at runtime. Your time to first byte is really low because they're on a CDN that's geographically close to you. They tend to be more responsive, partly because their JavaScript developers tend to be front-end developers, so they do that stuff pretty well. But also these frameworks like Gatsby and a couple others, they do something called intelligent prefetching, and they use tools on the build side that do something called resource bundling. So my actual page that I download that first time tends to be much smaller. So it makes it feel faster, which is perhaps one of the most important things of all, I would say. They also tend to be way, way more reliable. Actually, I wouldn't say they tend to be, they just are more reliable. So things like DDoS attacks that would take down your web server before, well, you have no web server. So you're not as liable to be hit by those things. Traffic spikes. So you send out an email that has 50% off coupons. Normally something like that, oh my gosh, I gotta scale up my web servers. Don't have to worry about that anymore. Those kind of things don't cause you the kind of headaches that they did before. And a fourth point, this was James' point that he made me put in there, and I forgot, it's way cheaper. You pay a nominal cost for the storage, and even the cost of keeping every version of your website is not high. And then you essentially pay for the bandwidth. There are some additional costs, a little bit for things like these server functions that James was saying, but the cost of hosting these things is so much lower than hosting web servers in a server farm and load balancers and switches and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, it also just takes, a lot of discussion away from like, you have an upcoming campaign and it's like, okay, well, what are we going to scale up to? What's our limit? You don't want to, pay too much because, that's just money out of your pocket, but you don't want to sort of shortchange yourself either. So you end up spending a little bit more to do those things. When you have a site that's built like this, you really don't need to even worry about that at all. It is infinitely scalable. And infinitely cheaper probably as well. You don't need to
infinite, but it approaches infinity. The other thing is, in terms of like things like Google page speed and those kind of insights, it's way easier to get higher scores on that with these kinds of sites, which we've seen.
Yeah, it sets you up for best practices. I mean, obviously you can still build a JAMstack site that does not use images very well or video and still have bad page speed scores, but it certainly gives you all of the tools to be able to set you up for success and does a lot of things for you just sort of out of the box.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually demo some stuff. We're going to show, James is going to take over the screen sharing here. Hopefully we can get that right in this webinar. Haven't done that yet. And I'm going to go and I'm going to stop my share. James, you want to start your share?
Right. All right. You guys can see my screen, right?
I can see it.
All right, cool. So what we're looking at here, I just chose a couple sites that are sort of currently using, this way of building websites. These aren't websites that are specifically built on Agility, but again, reminder, Agility CMS is a headless CMS. So it really doesn't, with these sort of frameworks, it's not calling Agility or any other CMS anyways. So it doesn't really matter if they're not necessarily on Agility or not. This is just to show sort of how the websites actually sort of work on the front end, what you can sort of come to expect from, building either new pages or converting your website over to JAMstack. So the site we're looking at here is braun.com, which is the sort of Canadian arm. And one of the things you'll notice, I'll just do a full refresh here. The site is pretty quick to load immediately. They do have some large images in here. So that does, affect their page speed score a little bit, but it's still quite high for the amount of media that they actually have. And as we actually start clicking around in different areas here, you'll see how snappy and responsive that was. I just clicked on a link there and it just immediately loaded. So you might be asking the question, well, how the heck does it do that? How is it so fast? It's almost like it knew that I was going to go to the page before I went to it. And if you're thinking that, you'd be absolutely right. I'll actually show you guys, what is happening here. So let me just refresh the website. And what we're looking at right now is the network tools. Let me just clear that out. So our initial page is loaded. As I start scrolling down the page here, you'll actually notice that there's additional requests that start coming out, specifically these path, dash. What's actually happening here is it's actually preloading the data that it needs for these pages before I even click on it. So by the time I actually do click on one of these items, it already has the data it needs. All it does is in JavaScript just hydrates that view. So it's extremely, extremely fast and snappy user experience as you're going around and navigating the website.
So it was rendered. So it was rendered as a static site with HTML that loaded the first time, but then once the page is in view, it acts like a single page application.
Exactly. This acts as a single page application. So there's essentially client-side logic that, captures this sort of on-click event and then uses the client-side router and then hydrates the next view with all of that data populated. So makes it even faster than just having static HTML pages because it also has a sort of SPA mode to it. Here's another site as well. This is Shop Flamingo, which has, I'm not entirely sure what they mostly sell, mainly feminine hygiene products such as razors, waxes, and that kind of thing. But this is also another example of, a fairly media heavy site, but it's still very fast. As I click around to different things, it loads up pretty much instantaneously. It's really just the images that are the high loads here. Oh, that was just the same page again. Let's go to something different. Shop, here we go. And you'll see that these images are lazy loaded as well. These are a lot of the things that just come out of the box on some of these frameworks. So if you're a front-end developer using something like Gatsby, you can get a lot of these things out of the box. You don't have to do a lot of work on yourself to be able to lazy load images and things like that. So some cool stuff. I just want to show you guys what some of the sort of front-end experiences you might expect from using a site this way. Joel, I'll hand it back to you.
We do have a question in here.
Oh yeah,
James. So this is from Kevin. Can it incorporate lazy load images to increase page loads even further?
Oh, boom, yes. So these sites specifically are built with Gatsby, which we're actually going to get into shortly here. And they are using, there's a specific image component that Gatsby uses. It's like essentially a React wrapper for like regular images. And what's really cool about that is there's a ton of these of options to configure how you load images. Lazy loading is enabled by default. So essentially it's not going to load your image unless it's sort of entering your viewport. You can obviously override that if you need to. But it also uses the picture, it's called the HTML5 picture tag. with a variety of different sources. So you can actually use that component to output several different image sizes of your image, and then the browser will only download the one that fits the current viewport. So that means you can have much larger images like this on your desktop, but when you actually go down to mobile, they'll actually load a smaller image because you don't need an image that's that big. So that's a very efficient way to be able to optimize your site for mobile, which is often one of the harder page speed scores to get high, is that mobile one. So it does all these things out of the box. Again, you wouldn't want to definitely use the Gatsby image component though for that specific feature.
Thanks, James. Brilliant. Let's jump back to the PowerPoint.
I've stopped sharing. Yeah, there you go.
So static sites are awesome. That's cool. But there's a really unique challenge here that James talked about a little bit. What about preview? So when the code and the content's all pre-rendered, how do we give our editors who are working with, they're working with staging content, and they want to see how things are going to look? How do we give them an experience where they can actually preview that content ahead of time? It's a really big deal, especially for CMS. Well, James has talked about Gatsby a little bit. That framework is one of the fastest growing frameworks on the web. It has, one of the most contributions in open source. It's an open source framework. Probably one of the best skills to learn right now is Gatsby. It has a really interesting answer and way to do this. So let's look at what goes into creating and building a static site with Gatsby. As it's one of our favorite tools right now, and how that gives you the ability to do something like preview. So how does Gatsby work? Well, first of all, it uses a GraphQL layer for all the data that you want to output statically. It doesn't mean you have to have GraphQL data. You could bring any data into this layer. So that includes your Agility CMS data. So we've actually built a starter kit with a plugin for Gatsby specifically for Agility. But you can also pull in your own custom data. So if you have your own, APIs and libraries, or some other data, it could be from any external source, you can write your own plugin. It's pretty easy to get that into this GraphQL layer. So what happens then is that gets basically enabled to use within your React code. So Gatsby is written on top of React. You create components. So there's page components, and then there's subcomponents from there that have access to all that data in GraphQL. It's really fast. Then goes through this build process where all that code is combined with the GraphQL data, and it's output as static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it does all that stuff that James was showing automatically. So as long as you use sort of the right best practices that Gatsby tells you to use their components and sort of learn how things are going, and it's really easy to do that, you get that SPA sort of activity, all that really great sort of performance benefits out of the box. They also do a ton for accessibility. As far as I'm concerned, it's a whole new way of thinking about developing for the web, and it fits right in with sort of being more agile and being able to launch faster.
Yeah. And one of the things I particularly like about Gatsby, and you touched on it there, is that sort of GraphQL layer of that idea where, you can have data from a whole bunch of different data sources, but really they're all going to be stored in one area and then easily queryable by a front-end developer. So, one of the strengths of a headless CMS, to be honest, is that it doesn't try to do too much. It's there to help editors manage their content, and it's there to provide easy tools for developers to be able to get that content, really.
We have a question. How does something like Gatsby support? And this would be a good question for any static for any HTML site, or static site as well, as how would it support something like load more?
So that's a good question. Couldn't tell you. I think Gatsby actually has a component out of the box to help you with that. But the idea is you'd still write client-side logic in the Gatsby site. So it doesn't happen on the server, but on client side, as you sort of scroll down the site and you get past that sort of certain point where you want to do something, you can then just with client side, use load more just like you would in a regular React site. Actually, there are React components out there that handle lazy loading for you that are like wrapper components. So you just use something like that and it'd work pretty much out of the box. But to that point as well, pagination is something else that also needs to be taken into consideration. And there's some docs that are more framework specific, especially for Gatsby, on how to do that. So I would check out the Gatsby.js.org. They have really, really good documentation there with a lot of frequently asked questions that can help you out there.
Awesome.
But yeah, you'd still be sourcing the same content. It's just how you work with it on the client side.
Cool.
But yeah, what I was getting at was, you know, the benefit of a headless CMS is we don't try to do too much. And I think there's really two schools of thought when it comes to sort of SaaS software right now. There's that sort of monolithic thing, like, you know, Adobe Experience Manager, for example, that does a lot of things for you, and sort of keeps you within that sort of bubble, but kind of harder to, you know, tweak and bend to your will. And then there's the other school of thought where it's like, I want to use the best tool for the job. So you might have, you know, Agility CMS as your CMS. You may use a different service for your personalization. You may use a different service entirely for your e-commerce, such as Shopify. GraphQL and this sort of source plugin process to go and pull that data and put it into GraphQL. All of that data sourcing can happen automatically just by registering a plugin and setting a few config options. It becomes so much easier to be able to integrate with those other services, and really create your sort of custom content mesh that can really make your site stand out from the rest.
Yeah, content mesh is a term that Gatsby has started using to talk about how, you know, the process of bringing all this stuff into GraphQL. So Gatsby is a big framework, and it's one of the ones that we're spending a lot of time working with and recommending folks to use. There's a couple other frameworks that are also really effective to use when building static sites. Another one, which is built on top of React, is called Next.js. So that's a really interesting framework. It has really just recently been used for static site generation. It's for a long time been used for server rendered sites. But what's really cool is if you're already using it for server rendered sites, or you really just like the way it works, it doesn't make you use GraphQL. You can use any way of pulling your data in that you want to build your components, and then it can render either from the server or as a static site as well. And there's another framework that's very similar to Next called Nuxt, which is not based on React, it's based on Vue.js. So if you are a Vue person, which actually I took to Vue initially when I started on JAMstack right away. And then Nuxt is another framework that, very similar to Next, it allows you to do server rendering or client rendering or static rendering of the site. So they're pretty interesting.
Yeah, and we have sample GitHub repos that show how you can use all three of these frameworks with Agility CMS. Right now, we're sort of using we have like a blog template that you can sign up for free on our agilitycms.com website. They all use that template just for simplicity, but it really illustrates how you can use all three of those frameworks. I think Joel personally wrote the Next.js one, and the Gatsby and Next.js are on our Agility GitHub repository. And so the other thing I want to take you guys through a little bit is show you a Gatsby site that works with Agility, and how preview works, and sort of how you sort of go from, okay, I have this thing running locally, how do I get this deployed, how to edit this, preview it, just to give you guys an idea of, you know, taking all the things we're sort of learning today and seeing that actually work in a real scenario. So Joel, if it's all right, I'm going to take over the screen again.
There you go.
All right. So let's close this and this. And what I want to show you guys is this site here, actually. The Agility Day is 2020. So we are actually planning our next Agility conference, May 26th and 27th. So we're actually just in the middle right now of finishing up our website that our Director of User Experience, Rob Carlin's been working on. He's been doing a great job. And so we built this using Gatsby, and we're also using a cloud service that Gatsby provides called Gatsby Cloud. And I'll go into that a little bit more afterwards. We're also using Netlify as our static website host in this case. So you'll see that by the domain name on the site, Agility Days website, .netlify.com. So when I'm running this locally, I would just be using VS Code. I'd run Gatsby develop, which is a CLI command, and I'd be able to run the site locally and play around with it. Making any changes to CSS, JavaScript, all has hot module reloading built in. So it's really quickly to be able to iterate on the front end stuff. I know this is part of the reason why Rob's been so productive on the site. I think he's only been working on it for a couple of days and he's already been able to get a whole bunch of stuff together. Further to that note too, you know, Rob, the guy that's been building this website for us, you know, he's not necessarily a full stack developer. He is not a .NET developer, but he knows front end really well and then he knows JavaScript really well. And so it was great that he was able to sort of stand up the site entirely on his own, and you know, didn't have to sort of involve any sort of you know, backend software engineer to set up a hosting environment or anything like that. This is all stuff he was able to do on his own. So it really shows the capabilities of this. So we've got this site here, and then we've also got our Agility CMS instance. I'm just going to make this a bit bigger here. A little bit of Zoom window, and this is just a single page website. Just for reference, let's go back to that. It's pretty simple. It's a single day conference or a 2-day conference. We don't need that many different pages on here. We might add some more later, but for now it's just a single page. And so, you know, what Joel had alluded to earlier was, you know, this is great. I have this sort of deployed and website, but you know, if I'm an editor and I want to make changes to this content, you know, I don't want to have to publish stuff, kick off a build, wait for that to deploy to be able to see my changes. I want to be able to make my changes and see them in somewhat real time. Similar to how a standard Agility CMS.net website works, in that you can see your changes in semi-real time. So what enables us to do this preview is this service that Gatsby has. So in Gatsby Cloud, this is my preview environment here. And you can see that this gives me a history of all of the sort of rebuilds that my preview has done today. That's because we've made a few content changes in the CMS, which then we have a webhook set up that automatically hits Gatsby Cloud and tells Gatsby Cloud, hey, refresh the preview site so the editors can see the content. So let's take a look at how that website looks. Again, looks pretty much exactly the same as you know, what we had in our deployed website. So I can actually go ahead and just make a content change here and be able to see this change happen. So I'm going to just put these windows side by side so we can see this. You'll see here, I'm on a module that actually controls the content for this text, as you guys see here. So let me just go ahead, add some more content to that, just so we can see that sort of change here. So I'm going to go ahead and just save that change. And what's going to happen here is it may take a few seconds, but the content on here is actually automatically going to update. And if you notice, I haven't actually refreshed the page yet either. We're just going to wait for that to go through. We switch back to the, oh, damn it, I was too fast. I switched away too quickly, but you can see that the content was updated there immediately. This actually works how Gatsby has hot module reloading working that's based on your GraphQL. So essentially what happened here is a webhook happened, Gatsby Cloud reran the source nodes and updated the content, and then notified our preview site to update the content here. So this is how you're able to provide a really fast preview environment for your editors, and it doesn't require them to have to kick off whole build or anything like that. So you can give them a very similar editing experience you have now. I think it's really important to, you know, we're talking a lot about like how this is better for developers to build websites, but you really need to keep in mind and have a lot of empathy for editors. You know, if you sell them on using JAMstack and you don't set up a preview environment they can't preview, they're not going to be happy with that change, regardless of how more efficient or how much you say the development experience is better. So definitely keep that top of mind. Make sure you have preview working. A note as well is that we are using Gatsby Cloud to have this preview environment set up, but we also know that it's possible to set up custom preview environments as well. We've done some tests using Azure App Service, as well as Heroku for other hosting services, so that you can actually deploy your Gatsby site essentially as a Node.js application in a container, and you can have your sort of own custom preview environment working that way as well. But Gatsby Cloud just gives you this really cool interface to be able to see what's going on, which is helpful as well. So now that we're looking at preview, now let's look at live, right? So again, this is our live website. Oops, that's our preview. Let me just close these guys. This is our live website we have here. And you'll notice that, the text here has not changed yet. That's because I haven't actually first of all, I haven't published that content change yet. But even if I do publish this content change, one of the things that's important to note here is that right now, the way we have this set up is still not going to update our live website. And I'll illustrate that by refreshing our live website. It doesn't change. That content is still exactly the same. So this comes back to the idea of having a static site generator. This site is statically generated. I've updated the content somewhere else. So in order to update the content here, I essentially need to do another build and deployment in production to be able to get that static HTML out there. Now, I think there are a few different ways you can sort of set up your DevOps. But in this particular case, we try to keep it pretty simple. So the way we would actually go about and actually deploy that change to production now is I'd actually go to my production thing here. And here I can actually see a URL of my previous build that was successful. So this is the same thing that's essentially live right now on my Netlify site. And as Joel had said too, these are all of my previous builds that I had before. So I can go and take a look at every single one of them. They each have their own unique build URL that I can look at them. But let's look at actually getting some live content there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to trigger a build. And what this is going to do is, I'm an editor now. I know everything I want is right. I publish my content. Now I'm going to actually trigger that deployment to go and update my website. So I've triggered a build. Gatsby builds literally was just released last week. So sometimes the builds are really fast. Sometimes they're slower than others. I think they're still trying to figure out some kinks. But let's see how long this one takes. It shouldn't be too long. And if you actually look at the logs, you can actually see exactly what it's doing. Actually, this one's been pretty fast. So the build's already done. It was deployed in 28 seconds. So I think that's quite reasonable. And that also we have this set up to automatically deploy to Netlify as well. So whenever this build succeeds, it automatically goes and deploys to Netlify, which means I should be able to go back to my website here, refresh the page, and you can see I now have that updated content. The really cool thing about this is these builds, as I said before, because everything needs to do a build, you have the opportunity to run automated reports. So if I look at the details of a build here, I can actually see my lighthouse scores. Gatsby Cloud does this built in. You can also do this custom in your own DevOps pipeline as well, but again, just nice to have this out of the box. So I can go take a look at the full report of the specific build, and I can see, we still have some areas to work on before we launch the site. There's always some things we could do better in terms of performance. Right now, I don't think we're using the Gatsby image component, so there's some things we can do to load our sort of top header as a smaller image for mobile. Accessibility, we're probably missing some alt tags or something somewhere. Best practices in SEO, so it gives you some direct recommendations on how to resolve those. So it's just a really great way to be able to sort of keep tabs on all of your website builds that are going out, and you'll know that if you have content that has really affected your page speed score, you might want to take action on that before it actually goes live. So that was a lot of information there. I'm sure there might be some questions related to that, but that sort of concludes what I wanted to show you guys regarding using something like Gatsby to be able to set up a JAMstack pipeline.
That's awesome. That was a lot of information. And what's really cool about that is I know you guys really just started, Rob's been working on the site for a little while in terms of the design, but in terms of getting it up onto Gatsby Cloud and getting it building, that was really, really easy. Correct me if I'm wrong. Super.
Oh, it was 10 minutes. We already had the code in GitHub. So when you create a Gatsby Cloud, I guess they call this a site. It was pretty straightforward. We connected it to our GitHub account, said, hey, this is the repository that's going to be connected to the master branch. So that means whenever a commit happens in that GitHub repository, or if we just manually hit trigger build, it's going to go grab the source code, run Gatsby build, which is going to go grab all the content we need, and then exports that all to HTML as you build, then runs the lighthouse reports on them. and then deploys to Netlify. So it was very easy to get that entire pipeline set up. And you don't have to use Gatsby Cloud. It's just a really quick way to get that set up and going, especially as a prototype. You can certainly do a lot of these things using like Azure DevOps pipelines or any other pipeline service you may be using.
Really, really cool. Awesome.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Okay, so we learned a lot about Gatsby there, and I'm sure there's a lot more sort of questions to come about that, about how how we can use it and whatnot. There's a lot to learn as well about Next, also a really great framework, and it has just like Gatsby has a Gatsby Cloud as a hosting model. On top of that, Next has a hosting model called Zeit,
Zeit
Yep. So that works with that. Really cool framework. We've had a few customers using that, but as well, Nuxt as well is gaining popularity.
Yeah, one of the things about Next that is actually fairly interesting is, they certainly take a different approach than Gatsby. It's more of a minimalist framework. Gatsby sort of forces you to do certain things a certain way, and that's so that it can enable a lot of the out-of-box performance benefits. Next.js is sort of more of a laissez-faire sort of attitude, where it gives you a lot more flexibility over things to sort of do things the way that you want to do it. So it may be more appropriate for some very specific enterprise requirements. So it's worth taking a look at that. But there is Zeit now hosting platform also has a built-in pipeline and things too. What's interesting about the way that they do things is that they actually deploy your Next.js site onto what they call a smart CDN, which is a CDN running serverless functions. So each one of your page routes actually technically runs in a serverless function. When you're running it as a statically generated site, it essentially only runs that function once, and then it just caches the output, and then it's just completely static. But what's interesting is that you can actually set up a parameter in the Next.js website source code to instruct their smart CDN to periodically invalidate the cache and run your serverless function again. So that means if you have some pages or some areas of the site that you actually want to be fairly dynamic, such as, you may want a page to update every minute. Maybe you have a scenario where you have, commenting or something on your website, and, you don't want to have to wait for a full rebuild in order for those new comments to show up. You could actually have that set up in a way where every minute the comments are updated and new content is pulled in. So you still have a statically generated site, but it's still somewhat dynamic in some ways. So it's a really interesting use case that they have. It's very new tech that they have too. Like the idea of building a statically generated site entirely using just Next.js is very new. In fact, it's still using unstable functions at the moment, but I suspect the next version, the next week or two, we'll promote that to production. We've also been in contact with Next.js developers as well as Gatsby.js developers as well with all of our source plugins and things. So if you guys have any specific questions and you're having trouble getting a hold of them too, let us know. We can certainly pass on some questions or some information for you.
Do you have a question from the group here from Chu? How does Agility support user data such as form submissions?
So that's a good question. So Agility CMS offers something called user-generated content, which is a sort of subcomponent of Agility CMS. And so that allows you to define, fields and things that you want to be able to collect form submissions. In terms of actually building the form and displaying that on the website, currently, if you're using an ASP.NET website as it is right now, using our sort of sync model, you can use our built-in form builder, and that'll just sort of work out of the box for you. To create and store simple submissions, form submissions. In the headless scenario, right now, what you would probably do if you wanted to use Agility user-generated content is that you'd actually have a developer code up the form and then use our UGC API, which you can use no problem, to be able to collect those form submissions and submit those to user-generated content. The other thing you can do as well is you don't necessarily have to use Agility UGC either. I talked a little bit about the sort of content mesh before, there are other services out there as well that can actually help you sort of easily have a place to create and automatically render form submissions. And we're going to be looking at possibly integrating with some of those services in the near future.
Yeah, the next question from Chu, again, thanks for all these questions, was about e-commerce. So when you look at something like a Gatsby site, it's really interesting how when you have this kind of content mesh that James was talking about, where you can pull lots of different data in. So not only can you pull in data from your Headless CMS, you can pull in data from your e-commerce system there as well. And so there's that side of it where the data gets pulled into GraphQL that's used to actually render the static website. But then after that, once you have the site rendered and you want to allow interactivity and things like a checkout for e-commerce or login and authentication, you then just use your regular client-side APIs. So if you're using the Agility also has an e-commerce component, or it could be that using Shopify, their component, so they have the JavaScript SDK that they provide. So there would be one set of calls that would you use to populate the GraphQL, and another set of calls that would you use that would be purely from the client side from there. And then in addition, if you're hosting in something like Netlify, where you do not have a web server, you can build your own web APIs that are, either Node, whatever, to do if you have a custom backend processing that you want to do. Or you can take advantage of, for something like Netlify, they have what's called Netlify Functions, which provides kind of like functions as a service, which is a FaaS, which is kind of a new idea, where you can work with APIs that aren't necessarily pre-built for if you have to make like a server-to-server call first.
And there's another question here. Joel, I don't know if you want to take this one, or if you mind if I take it?
Take it.
All right, cool. So we get asked this a lot. The question is, why use Agility over, WordPress? Actually, they say Headless WordPress site. So there's a couple things. WordPress gives you some certain functionality out of the box. They allow you to manage things like blog posts and a couple other areas. But if you need something more sort of on top of that, you then start to have to look at plugins and that kind of thing. So there you start really customizing your WordPress thing. And then now you sort of have to maintain that over time as well. So a Headless CMS like Agility CMS, also one that's multi-tenanted, which means we manage your database. You don't have to touch or anything like that. It's built from the ground up to be able to handle complex content schemas. So if you're in a scenario where you're sort of like trying to customize WordPress too much and you're getting sort of frustrated, that's going to be an area where you're going to want to look at a Headless CMS that's specifically designed for stuff like that, because we have pretty much infinite capabilities to be able to configure custom content models. So if you want to create a blog post and you want to add a bunch of different types of fields that make sense to you, you can go ahead and do that very easily, no plugins or anything like that. We also have a built-in concept of page management, which gives you a very granular control over all of the content that is on your pages. So, really to answer your question, it's infrastructure and, the capabilities to be able to do a lot more things that WordPress can't, or that WordPress was not specifically designed for. I could also get into some things around security. So that's often a concern with WordPress too, especially in terms of like who manages and maintains their WordPress instance. So Agility CMS is a multi-tenant CMS. That means all of our customers get updates immediately. We also don't dictate how your website is going to be built either. So just generally speaking, a lot more flexibility. Our APIs are also multi-tenanted as well and behind a CDN. So you don't have to manage your own API back in there either.
Great question. Really great question. A lot of the customers that we have now that are coming to us, usually coming either from WordPress or WordPress is one of the things that they're looking at, and they're trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do? And really choosing a Headless CMS like Agility really future-proofs your system. Because you can spend a little bit more time. What James is really talking about there is something that we call content architecture, where you do what's called a content first approach, where you decide what is my content going to look like before I actually go and build my website. And going through that process makes your content really valuable. And that's we've got some videos that are coming out soon that will go through that sort of content first approach to talk about how that works. Great. Do we have any more questions? I'd like to sort of continue the conversation here. That's the end of our sort of official webinar slides that we have. We invite all of you to follow us if you're not already following us at Agility CMS on Twitter. That's where we sort of post most of our stuff. We invite you, if you're a developer, go sign up for a free account on Agility right now, agilitycms.com/free. And then if you're not a developer and you're just really interested, and it's like, hey, I need this JAMstack thing on my site right now, I need to figure this out. Get in touch with our sales folks. They have a ton of information already they can give you, but they can also get you in touch with our, not only our internal senior folks, but also with some implementation partners that can help you do this yourself. So sales@agilitycms.com. Looks like there's another question.
Yeah, there's a question here that I'll address. The question is, if I understand it correctly, my content will live on the edge. Do I have any control to manually invalidate the cache? That's a great question. So in our example that we looked at here, we had a Gatsby site that was hosted on Netlify, which is on a CDN. So Netlify is a hosted service that sort of does all this stuff for you automatically. That means whenever a deployment happens, they automatically purge the cache. It's not something you have to worry about. Now, in a real world scenario, if you're building a site, you may not be able to use Netlify for whatever reasons. It could be because the customer says, hey, no, you need to use AWS, or it needs to be hosted on CloudFront or something like that. In which case, the scenarios there, what you might do can change, or what you might need to do. So there may be scenarios if you're building your sort of custom pipeline where when you actually deploy that out somewhere, yeah, you may need to also send an API request to the CDN to say, hey, purge the CDN, there's new content there. Does cool. Did that sort of answer your question?
I think so. That was Pim.
Oh, yeah, nice.
Good to hear from you, Pim.
Yeah.
Cool. So, yeah, in just sort of continuing the conversation even further, check out our community page, agilitycms.com/community. On there, we post all the upcoming events and all the stuff that's happening. Really, one of the things that sort of our mission at Agility is to help make you guys better leaders. And so our community events are really tuned towards that, towards trying to teach folks sort of about new technologies, about content-first approaches, and different ways of doing that in terms of, like, what we call it, the whole product picture, right from the beginning of thinking about something to the point where you've got it iterating and improving on it. So on that page, it has links to join us on our Slack channel and to join us on GitHub.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, if you guys are curious to learn more about JAMstack and getting involved in the community and talking to more developers using this stuff, we're all members here at Agility of the JAMstack Toronto meetup. We meet up usually once every month, sometimes every few months. There's an upcoming one February 19th. I think it's at Wrangle.io. I'll be doing a talk there actually on building JAMstack right with page management. So if you're curious to hear about that talk, I recommend signing up for the meetup and coming up. It's free to join, and there's usually beer and fun people there, so you should come.
Cool. Our next webinar. So we are going to be hosting these webinars monthly at least. We may actually end up doing some more webinars. We may end up doing some workshops with folks. We've had some asks to do that. But the next webinar will be on March 6th, so a month from today. And the topic of that one is migrate to JAMstack without rebuilding everything. So it's going to be a really interesting topic, something that we're talking to a lot of people about. It's like, I have this huge website. I have, it might be an Agility website, or it might be just, hey, it's my WordPress site or whatever. And I want to not touch that thing. But I'd like to fix these pages because the Google page speed is terrible, or I want to fix this, add this new section. How can I do that with JAMstack?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. Going to have some fun with that one.
And as James already pre-announced, Agility Days is coming up in May. This is our company summit. It's going to bring together customers and partners, everyone together for sort of deeper learning, product training, thought leadership on being more agile, content-first methodologies, that sort of stuff. and networking, just a chance for, people to meet each other, for our customers and partners that maybe they're across the country or all over the world, for a chance to meet us. So keep an eye on that community page on our website for more details. The registration, as we were hard at work on that website, registration will open up soon for that.
Website coming soon, and we're gonna have it as close as possible to 100 page speed score. At least that's the plan, anyways. We'll see if we get there.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any more questions, thanks everyone for tuning in. This was great. We did a ton of participants. Really, really good to see folks coming out. Some great questions. I was happy to do this. James, how you feel?
Feel good. Thanks, Jason. I'll see you at the JAMstack meetup as well.
Cool. Take care, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye-bye.